The tariffs kicked in at midnight, not with a bang, but with a clause. A 35% levy slapped onto Canadian goods not protected under the USMCA. Border agents were ordered to reclassify imports at dawn. Ontario's telescopic optics, Quebec's aluminum billets, softwood lumber from British Columbia, frozen in place. American buyers scrambled for compliance certificates. Just 5 hours earlier, Trump had smirked into a camera and signed what he called economic justice. But Canada didn't blink, because it saw something Trump didn't. While the White House sold the move as punishment, Ottawa pushed paperwork, certificates, exemptions, loophole protections, legal shields. By the time the tariffs landed, 95% of Canadian trade was already safeguarded under USMCA clauses, most of it structured in since January. It wasn't sabotage. It was insurance, and it worked. The executive order targeted $40 billion in exports. Only $2 billion took the hit. The rest slipped through, untouched and legal. Trump framed it as retaliation for Canada's supposed lack of cooperation. His team cited trade deficits, steel dumping, even fentanyl. Yet CBP data showed less than 0.2% of all fentanyl seizures came from the Canadian border. Meanwhile, U.S. banks, allegedly barred from Canada, continued normal operations under OSFI regulations. His argument was rhetorical, not statistical, a list of accusations without evidence. And Carney saw the pattern. Canada didn't retaliate with threats. It responded with borders. Liquor control boards began pulling American spirits from store shelves. Provincial contracts started excluding U.S. suppliers. Tourism advisories hinted at economic pushback, not through speeches, but procurement policies. Quiet moves, deep cuts. And at the precise moment Trump posted "wow" about Palestine, Canada pulled the pin. Carney announced formal recognition of Palestinian statehood just hours after the tariff hike. It wasn't a spontaneous act of foreign policy. It was deliberate defiance. Trump had demanded silence. Carney gave him headlines. He reframed the crisis from trade to human rights. Now, Trump wasn't punishing Canada. He was punishing a recognized ally of Palestine. This wasn't about cheese tariffs anymore. It was about sovereignty. And that changed the story. Markets didn't crash, they recalculated. The Bank of Canada projected just a 0.1% GDP contraction. Softwood lumber, though hit, was backed by $1.2 billion Canadian dollars in emergency credits. Small businesses in Nova Scotia and Saskatchewan rerouted exports through USMCA-certified distribution hubs. Industrial unions in Alberta doubled down on domestic production. There was no collapse. There was cold mobilization. Trump's goal was isolation. What he triggered was alignment. Mexico immediately welcomed Canadian trade envoys. Brazil offered joint infrastructure talks. EU diplomats called Canada's response mature under pressure. Meanwhile, American governors from New York to Michigan demanded clarity. Ontario alone buys more U.S. goods than Japan, France, and the U.K. combined. 9 million American jobs rely on Canadian-linked supply chains, and now every one of them was at risk. In the middle of the chaos, Carney disappeared. No press conference. No angry tweets. No rebuttals. Just silence for 36 hours. And that silence wasn't weakness. It was control. While Trump waged a media war, Carney played a structural one. And when he reappeared, it wasn't to negotiate. It was to walk away. Let's pause here, because this wasn't the standoff Trump planned. It was something stranger. The man who thrives on reaction got none. The president who weaponizes urgency found himself pacing alone. And in that void, a new contradiction emerged. The loudest leader lost the room, while the quietest one redrew the map. Doug Ford, however, did not stay quiet. The Ontario Premier issued a statement more blunt than diplomatic. We will stop buying. We will stop building with their metal. We will cancel the contracts. Quebec announced plans to domesticate aluminum processing. Steel buyers who had once outsourced shaping to Ohio now inked deals with plants in Sarnia. Ford called it an economic redirection. Others called it a supply chain revolt. But this revolt wasn't ideological. It was mathematical. U.S. tariffs on foreign cans added 25%. Canada had been exporting raw materials south and buying them back as finished goods. The value left the country and returned, marked up. Ford's policy flipped that script. The U.S. didn't just lose exports. It lost margin. A billion-dollar hole formed in cross-border manufacturing. Trump thought Canada would fold. Instead, it automated. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce reported that since June, 61% of small and mid-sized exporters had applied for USMCA compliance for the first time. That's not protest, it's policy. Trump's aggression forced adaptation. And even the hardest-hit sectors, lumber, auto, dairy, began routing around the pain using exemptions and domestic buffers. But the real twist came from within Trump's own camp. In a Fox Business interview, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick quietly admitted the tariffs were partly triggered by disrespectful digital policy. Ottawa had withdrawn its digital services tax in June to appease U.S. negotiators. It didn't matter. The damage was done. The message was clear. Canada didn't cave. It recalibrated. The concession bought no goodwill. Within 30 days, new tariffs hit anyway. Trump had moved the goalpost again. The message to Canada was clear. Appeasement wouldn't protect them. Only autonomy would. Just weeks after being called a nice gentleman by Trump, Carney stopped playing diplomat. His government halted defense procurement from U.S. suppliers, revoked energy import licenses, and suspended bilateral sub-agreements outside the USMCA. Not out of spite, but out of logic. When the rules change daily, you stop playing by theirs. That logic resonated. Even Pierre Poilievre, Carney's opposition leader, refused to turn the crisis into a partisan opportunity. Instead, he stated plainly, no deal is better than a crooked one. Lana Payne of Unifor echoed the sentiment. This isn't about strategy anymore, it's about dignity. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business, usually cautious, dismissed the fentanyl rationale as absurd. And what about that claim? CBP data showed that less than 1% of total fentanyl seizures occurred at the northern border. Yet Trump's executive order cited Canada's failure to stop the flow of synthetic opioids as a primary justification for tariffs. Factually unsupported, the claim served as narrative camouflage. Carney didn't deny the accusation, he neutralized it. He announced a $900 million border strategy and appointed a national fentanyl czar. In one move, he removed the pretext by addressing an invented problem. With that, he stripped the White House of its justification. When closed-door talks resumed, Carney wasn't asking for more time. He was daring Trump to raise the stakes again. But boxed in by business backlash and legal ambiguity, Trump had few cards left. The legal authority used to impose the tariffs, the AIPA, was already under review in federal court. Multiple lawsuits filed by U.S. industry groups argued that the executive order had overstepped congressional trade authority. If the courts ruled narrowly, the tariffs could collapse under their own legal weight. In the meantime, reputational damage had already begun to seep. Tourism from Canada to Florida fell 14%. Cross-border summer traffic declined. Napa Valley wineries reported sudden cancellations from Canadian distributors. Back in Washington, several Republican senators privately urged the president to de-escalate, not out of opposition to tariffs, but because they understood the optics. Trump, who built his brand on economic dominance, was now being outmaneuvered by a country that refused to engage in the spectacle. And this was no longer just about Canada. If Carney succeeded, if quiet resistance and structural alignment proved stronger than bluster and escalation, others were watching. Australia began reviewing its supply chain exposure. Japan started reevaluating steel clauses in its U.S. trade deals. The Philippines began recalibrating its agricultural export reliance on California. What Canada was building wasn't passive, it was a model. This crisis began with Trump declaring Canada poorly led. But now, Carney's approval rating remained steady at 63%. The Canadian dollar held firm. Bond yields stayed anchored. And among G7 nations, Canada was now ranked by investor indexes as the most politically predictable. Trump fired a warning shot. Carney walked away without flinching because he'd already built the shield. This wasn't a tariff war. It was a governance test. And the man who governs by mood just met the country that governs by math. Now a new risk looms, one Trump may not have anticipated. The USMCA is up for formal review in 2026. Any party can withdraw with 6 months' notice. According to Reuters, Carney's office has already begun quiet legal consultations on a potential exit strategy. This isn't a bluff. If the U.S. keeps shifting the terms through executive fiat, the treaty's foundation begins to crumble, risking a domino effect that could unravel the entire framework. Meanwhile, Bloomberg reports a surge in Chinese and EU trade delegations visiting Ottawa and Montreal, eager to absorb Canadian exports displaced by U.S. volatility. Germany's ambassador proposed a fast-tracked critical minerals deal for EV batteries, aimed at replacing U.S. auto partnerships. This isn't decoupling. It's recoupling on Canada's terms. And another contradiction is unfolding. While Trump isolates, Carney is forming trade triangles. A trilateral initiative with Mexico and Brazil is under internal review, proposing joint infrastructure corridors and shared agricultural certifications. If finalized, it would bypass U.S. oversight entirely, diversifying Latin American trade without Washington. Investors are already taking note. As of August 5th, U.S. equity exposure to Canadian industries dropped 3.2%, while Canadian sovereign bonds rallied. Capital is betting on stability, and right now that's not in Washington. Trump wanted to teach Canada a lesson. But the lesson may be this: the more you weaponize trade, the faster your rivals learn to live without you. And next time Trump tries to use tariffs as leverage, there may be no one left at the table.